"Don't bother explaining the contract," Victor Hale said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the room. "She probably can't even read it." The words didn't just land, they echoed, bouncing off crystal glasses, polished marble, and the quiet arrogance that filled the private dining room on the 48th floor of a Manhattan high-rise where a single dinner could cost more than most people's monthly rent, and for a split second, everything slowed, forks hovered midair, a glass of red wine paused inches from someone's lips, and even the pianist in the corner seemed to miss a note as the insult settled into the air like smoke no one wanted to breathe. And standing just behind Victor's chair, holding a tray with 2 untouched glasses of sparkling water, Ava Monroe didn't flinch, not a blink, not a shift in posture, nothing, just stillness, the kind that looks like submission to people who don't know the difference, but her eyes moved, quietly, precisely, taking in every face at the table, every subtle smirk, every uncomfortable glance that flickered away too quickly, because this wasn't new to her, not the tone, not the assumption. Not the way people with money mistook silence for ignorance, and around the table sat executives, investors, and legal advisors, all dressed in tailored suits that whispered power, gathered for a deal rumored to be worth over $500 million, a merger that could shift markets and headlines overnight, and Victor Hale, CEO of Hale Industries, sat at the center of it all like a man who had never once doubted his place in any room he entered, his cufflinks catching the warm light as he leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, completely certain, because to him, people were roles, functions, tools, and a waitress was just that, background, invisible unless needed, and certainly not someone who belonged anywhere near a contract discussion, and yet Ava had heard every word, not just the insult, but the conversation that came before it, the numbers, the clauses, the subtle misinterpretation that no one else seemed to catch, and still she said nothing, not yet, because silence, she had learned, was not weakness, it was timing, and timing was everything, especially in a room where one mistake could cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. And across the table, one of the investors shifted slightly, clearing his throat as if to smooth over the moment, but the tension didn't fade, it thickened, because something about the way Ava stood there, calm, composed, untouched by the weight of Victor's words, felt off, like a scene that hadn't finished playing out yet, and Victor, sensing none of it, continued, flipping a page in the contract with a casual flick of his wrist. "Let's keep this efficient," he added, not even glancing at her, "we don't need unnecessary interruptions," and a few quiet chuckles followed, the kind that weren't really laughter but compliance dressed as humor, and still, Ava didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react, because in a room built on power, the loudest voice usually wins, until someone proves they don't need to be loud at all, and somewhere between the clink of silverware and the soft hum of the city 48 floors below, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and no one at that table, not Victor, not the investors, not the advisors, realized that the person they had just dismissed as invisible was the only one in the room who truly understood what was about to go wrong. The deal did not pause for long because money does not wait for discomfort, and within seconds the conversation resumed, smoother on the surface but tighter underneath, like a string pulled just a little too far, and Victor continued walking the investors through the contract, tapping specific sections with the back of his pen, outlining projections, timelines, market advantages. Every word delivered with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, but as he spoke, Ava shifted slightly, just enough to place the tray down on a nearby service station, her movements quiet, deliberate, almost invisible, yet her attention remained fixed on the document in front of him, because buried inside paragraph 17, between dense legal language and polished phrasing, there was a flaw, not obvious, not careless, but dangerous, the kind of oversight that does not reveal itself until it is too late, and she had seen it the moment he mentioned the cross-border clause, the way the wording conflicted with international compliance standards, the way one misinterpretation could trigger penalties that would erase the very profit he was promising, and still, she said nothing, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the room, understood that truth, when spoken at the wrong moment. Sounds like interruption, and interruption, in a room like this, is dismissed before it is heard, and across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward, asking a question about liability coverage, his tone cautious, precise, and Victor answered quickly, confidently, almost too quickly, brushing past the nuance, simplifying what should not have been simplified, and Ava felt it then, that subtle shift again. Not in the room, but in the trajectory of the deal itself, like watching a train move confidently toward a track that was not aligned, and she could have stayed silent, she could have walked away, finished her shift, gone home, and let the outcome unfold without her, because none of this was her responsibility, none of this was her problem, but something held her there, something deeper than obligation, something rooted in a quiet understanding that knowledge, once seen, carries weight, and ignoring it does not make it disappear, and Victor, unaware, continued. Flipping another page, his voice steady, "Everything here has been reviewed," he said, "there are no gaps," and that was the moment, not loud, not dramatic, just a single sentence that closed the door on doubt and sealed the illusion of control, and Ava exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, and for the first time, she stepped forward, not into the spotlight, not into defiance, but into alignment with something that had already begun, her voice calm, even. Measured, "Excuse me," she said, just enough to be heard, not enough to demand attention, and a few heads turned, some surprised, some irritated, Victor included, his expression tightening slightly as he glanced at her, not angry, not yet, but clearly unaccustomed to being interrupted, especially not by someone he had already dismissed, and there was a pause, brief but heavy, the kind that asks a question without words, and Ava met it without hesitation, her posture steady, her tone unchanged. "There is a discrepancy in Section 17, she said, and the room shifted again, sharper this time, because now it was no longer about tone or perception, it was about substance, and for the first time that night, the silence that followed was not filled with judgment, but with attention. Victor did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed because men like him were known for speed, for certainty, for answers that arrived before questions fully formed, and yet here he was, looking at her, really looking at her for the first time, as if trying to reconcile the role he had assigned her with the tone she had just used, calm, precise, unshaken. And a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, not warm, not kind, but controlled. "I think we are fine," he said, turning slightly back toward the table as if to dismiss the moment without confrontation. "Legal has already cleared every section," and a few heads nodded, not in agreement, but in habit, because authority, when delivered with enough confidence, often sounds like truth. But Ava did not step back, did not apologize, did not soften her stance. Instead she moved one step closer to the table, just enough to see the document clearly, her voice steady. "The cross-border compliance clause references a standard that was updated last quarter," she said, and this time, the words landed differently, not as interruption, but as information, and one of the investors, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for caution, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he flipped to the page in question. "Which standard are you referring to?" he asked, not dismissive, not defensive, just curious, and Ava did not rush her answer, she did not perform, she simply spoke. "The European Regulatory Framework Revision from March," she replied, her pronunciation precise, her tone measured, the language here still aligns with the previous version, which would make this clause vulnerable to misinterpretation under current guidelines, and the room shifted again, deeper this time, because now the conversation had moved beyond ego and into risk, real, measurable risk, and Victor's expression tightened, just slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table before he reached for the document, scanning the section with more attention than before, and for a brief moment, the confidence in his posture flickered, not gone, but challenged, and the silver-haired investor spoke again, slower now, more deliberate. "If that is accurate, the liability exposure could increase significantly," he said, and another voice joined in, quieter but firm, "That would delay approval on our end," and suddenly the room was no longer aligned behind Victor, it was evaluating him, reassessing, recalibrating, and Ava stood there, not triumphant, not emotional, just present, as if she had simply pointed out something obvious, something that should have been seen, and Victor looked up again, this time not past her, but directly at her, his gaze sharper, searching. "And how exactly do you know that?" he asked, the question controlled but edged with something new, not mockery, not yet respect, but recognition that the balance had shifted, and Ava held his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, unadorned. Because it was written in 5 languages, she said, and for a fraction of a second. Confusion crossed his face, just enough to open the door for what was coming next. The room did not erupt, it did not gasp, it did something far more powerful, it went still, the kind of stillness that does not come from confusion but from recalibration, because what Ava had just said did not fit into the version of reality everyone had quietly agreed on just minutes ago, and Victor felt it, not as noise, but as pressure, subtle and precise, like a shift in air before a storm breaks. And he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, controlled. What do you mean 5 languages? He asked, each word deliberate, as if choosing them carefully could restore the balance he felt slipping, and Ava did not rush to answer. She reached for the document, not abruptly, not with entitlement, but with a calm certainty that made the movement feel natural, almost expected, and for a brief second, no one stopped her, not because she had permission, but because no one was sure anymore who had the authority to deny it, and she turned the page gently, her fingers steady, her eyes scanning lines she had already memorized, and then she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that every person at the table could hear each word as if it had been placed directly in front of them. The original clause was drafted in English, she said, but it was reviewed and mirrored across multiple jurisdictions, and then, without pause, she continued, her voice shifting seamlessly, flowing into French with a natural ease that did not ask for attention yet demanded it, the pronunciation precise, the cadence confident, as she quoted the equivalent clause, highlighting the discrepancy in phrasing that altered its legal interpretation, and before anyone could process the shift, she transitioned into German, the tone slightly firmer, the structure more rigid, explaining how the wording there aligned with the updated compliance framework, her delivery not rehearsed but lived, as if these languages were not tools she used, but environments she moved through, and the silence deepened, not empty, but full, saturated with the realization that something extraordinary was unfolding in the most ordinary posture, a waitress standing beside a table, and then she moved into Spanish, her voice warmer, but no less precise, pointing out the inconsistency that could trigger regulatory review, and finally, she returned to English, not as a fallback, but as a conclusion, tying each thread together with clarity that left no room for doubt. The current version in this document does not match the updated standard in any of the translated frameworks, she said, her tone unchanged, which means it is internally inconsistent and externally vulnerable, and when she finished, she did not look around for approval, she did not seek validation, she simply stepped back half a step, giving the room space to catch up to what had just happened, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they did, completely, and that understanding required them to reconsider everything they had assumed just moments before, and Victor sat there, the document still open in front of him, his eyes fixed on the page but his thoughts clearly elsewhere, recalculating, reassessing, and for the first time that night, the confidence that had defined his presence was no longer effortless. It was intentional, constructed, and just slightly strained, and across the table, the silver-haired investor exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze shifting from the document to Ava, not with surprise anymore, but with something closer to respect, that would explain the discrepancy in the risk projections. He said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, and another executive nodded, flipping through their own copy, verifying, confirming, and the room, once aligned behind a single voice, was now orbiting a new center, not louder, not more forceful, but undeniably more precise, and Victor finally looked up, meeting Ava's eyes again, but this time there was no dismissal in his gaze, no casual superiority, only a question that had replaced the certainty he walked in with, and though he did not say it out loud, it was clear in the way he held that moment, in the way the room held it with him. The question was no longer whether she belonged there, but how no one had seen it sooner. No one rushed to speak because the room was no longer operating on momentum, it was operating on realization, slow, deliberate, unavoidable, and Victor felt it settle around him like a weight he could not shift with confidence alone, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes returning to the document, scanning lines he had already approved, already presented, already believed were flawless. But now each sentence carried a different tone, not certainty, but question, and across the table, the investors were no longer watching him for direction, they were watching the pages, flipping, cross-checking, quietly verifying the discrepancy that Ava had just exposed with a calmness that made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence, and the silver-haired investor spoke again, this time more firmly. "We need to pause," he said, not loudly, but with authority that did not need volume, and that single sentence shifted the entire room, because a pause at this level, at this scale, was not a minor inconvenience, it was a signal, a warning, a recalibration of trust, and Victor leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to betray the effort it took to remain composed. "It is a minor inconsistency," he said, attempting to regain control. "Something legal can revise quickly," but the words did not carry the same weight they had earlier, not because they were wrong, but because they were no longer the most informed, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything, and one of the executives across from him shook his head slightly. "If it affects compliance across jurisdictions, it is not minor," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It changes our exposure." And another voice followed, "And it changes our timeline," and just like that, the conversation that had once been centered around Victor's vision was now centered around a risk he had overlooked, and Ava stood just outside the table's edge, not inserted into the discussion, not invited, but undeniably present within it, because her words had not just interrupted the flow, they had redirected it. And Victor looked at her again, this time longer, more carefully, as if trying to understand not just what she had said, but who she was, because the gap between his assumption and her reality was now too large to ignore. "You said the clause was written in 5 languages, he said slowly, his voice quieter now, less performative, more precise. "Which ones?" And Ava answered without hesitation, "English, French, German, Spanish, and Japanese," she said, her tone steady. "Each version reflects a different regulatory interpretation, and they must align to avoid conflict," and there was no pride in her voice, no need to impress, just clarity, and that clarity cut through the room more effectively than any authority had earlier, and the silver-haired investor nodded once, a small but decisive gesture. "We will need a full review," he said, closing his folder with a soft but final sound, before moving forward, and the implication settled immediately. The deal was no longer progressing, it was stopping, not collapsing, not yet, but suspended, waiting, uncertain, and Victor's hand rested flat against the table, his fingers still, his posture composed, but the shift was undeniable. Because control had not been taken from him, it had simply moved elsewhere, to the truth, to the detail. To the person who had seen what others had missed, and for a moment, the room existed in that new alignment, quieter, sharper, more aware, and Ava, who had entered it as someone unseen, now stood at its center without ever asking to be there, and the irony did not need to be spoken, it was felt, in the silence, in the glances, in the subtle recalculations happening behind every composed expression, because the person who had been dismissed as incapable had just become the reason the room did not make a very expensive mistake, and that realization, more than anything else, was what no one could ignore. The room did not dissolve into chaos because power does not crumble loudly, it shifts quietly, and in that quiet shift Victor Hale understood something he had not prepared for, not a failure of numbers, not a flaw in execution, but a failure of perception, and that realization did not show in his posture, it showed in the way he slowed down, the way his movements became more deliberate, as if each action now required verification instead of instinct, and across the table, the investors were no longer leaning toward him, they were leaning into their own documents, their own thoughts, recalculating positions that had once felt certain, and the energy in the room had changed from admiration to assessment, from following to evaluating, and that difference, though subtle, was irreversible, and Ava remained where she stood, neither stepping forward nor retreating, her presence steady, grounded, untouched by the tension that had begun to ripple outward from the center of the table, because for her, nothing had changed, not the room, not the people, not the expectations, only the truth had surfaced, and truth does not raise its voice, it simply stands where it has always been, waiting to be seen, and Victor finally closed the document, not with frustration, not with force, but with a controlled motion that signaled a pause he could no longer avoid, and when he looked up again, his gaze held something new, not defeat, not yet, but awareness. The kind that arrives too late to prevent the moment but early enough to redefine what comes next. "We will review the clause," he said, his tone measured, careful, stripped of the earlier confidence that had carried the room, and though the words sounded like leadership, they no longer felt like control, because the decision had already been influenced, shaped, redirected by someone he had dismissed minutes earlier, and the silver-haired investor nodded once, accepting the statement but not restoring the authority behind it. "We will reconvene after legal confirms alignment," he replied, his voice calm but final, and with that, the meeting did not end, it dissolved, not abruptly, but with a series of quiet movements, chairs shifting, folders closing, conversations breaking into smaller, more cautious exchanges, and in those exchanges, Ava's presence lingered, not physically, but conceptually, as a variable no one had accounted for, a factor that had changed the outcome without ever being part of the plan. And Victor remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his eyes following the movement in the room. Before settling once more on Ava, and this time, when he spoke, there was no audience to perform for, no room to impress, only a single question directed at a single person. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost reflective, and Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, not guarded, not open, simply present. "I read," she said. And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not justify, it did not defend, it did not seek approval, it stated a fact, and in that moment, the word he had used earlier, the label he had placed on her without thought, returned to him not as accusation, but as contrast, and the distance between what he had assumed and what was true became impossible to ignore, and he nodded once, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but significant in its restraint, because it was not agreement, it was acknowledgement, and as Ava reached for her tray again, lifting it with the same quiet precision she had carried it before, she did not look back at the table, did not linger in the space she had altered, because her role, as defined by the room, had not changed, only their understanding of it had, and as she walked away, her step steady, her posture unchanged, the room behind her remained quieter than before, not because something had been lost, but because something had been revealed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The night did not end when the meeting dissolved, it stretched, lingered, unfolding in quiet layers that no one at that table could fully ignore, because even as the investors filtered out of the private room, their conversations low and controlled, the tone had changed, not just about the deal, but about judgment, about oversight, about the unseen variables that had just proven themselves impossible to dismiss. And Victor Hale remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the closed folder, not opening it, not moving it, just feeling the weight of something that was no longer theoretical, and around him the room began to return to its usual rhythm, waitstaff moving efficiently, glasses replaced, surfaces cleared, the quiet choreography of service resuming as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had, because the illusion that had filled that space earlier, the certainty, the control, the hierarchy, had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to let something real through, and across the room Ava Monroe moved with the same steady pace she had carried all evening, collecting plates, refilling glasses, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if the moment that had just altered the direction of a multi-million-dollar deal had been nothing more than a passing detail in her shift, and that contrast, more than anything else, unsettled Victor, because he was used to reactions, to acknowledgement, to the subtle signals that confirmed his presence as the center of any room, but Ava had offered none of that, not before, not during, not after, and that absence forced him to confront something unfamiliar, the idea that influence did not always announce itself, that impact did not always ask to be seen, and he stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with a practiced motion. But there was a pause in it now, a fraction of a second where certainty used to live, and as he stepped away from the table, his gaze moved across the room until it found her again, not by accident, but by intention, because now he was looking, truly looking, and when he approached, it was without the performance that had defined him earlier, no audience, no posture, just a man crossing a room towards someone he no longer understood, and Ava noticed him before he spoke, not because she was watching him, but because she noticed everything, the shift in footsteps, the change in rhythm, the way the air subtly adjusted when attention moved in her direction, and she turned slightly, meeting his presence with the same calm she had carried all night, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not out of hesitation, but because the dynamic that had defined their first interaction no longer applied, and Victor broke the silence first, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "You saw something no one else did," he said, not as a challenge, not as a question, but as a statement that acknowledged what had happened without trying to control it, and Ava nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "It was there," she replied, her tone simple, unembellished, and that simplicity landed differently now, because it did not seek credit, it did not expand on itself, it just existed, and Victor studied her for a moment, not with skepticism, but with a kind of recalibration, as if adjusting to a new set of parameters he had not anticipated. "You should not be doing this," he said finally, gesturing lightly toward the tray in her hand, and there was no insult in it this time, no dismissal, just a statement shaped by the assumption that talent must align with status, and Ava's response came just as calmly as everything else she had said. "I am doing what I need to do," she answered, and there was no explanation attached, no story offered, no justification given, just truth, and that truth did not invite further questioning. It closed the space with quiet finality, and Victor nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because he recognized that understanding was no longer something he could assume, and as he stepped back, the distance between them restored but not reset, the room continued its motion around them, unaware or perhaps simply unwilling to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had felt the recalibration of power, the night would not be easily forgotten, because sometimes the most important changes do not come from who speaks the loudest, but from who sees the clearest, and in that room, on that night, clarity had come from the one person no one had been looking at until it was too late to ignore her. The night carried on, but not in the way it had begun, because once a room has been forced to see something it had ignored, it does not return to the same blindness, and even as new guests arrived and the soft glow of the city lights reflected against the glass walls, there was a quiet shift in the way conversations unfolded, more careful, more measured, as if everyone who had witnessed the earlier moment now carried an unspoken awareness that certainty could be challenged at any time, and Victor Hale felt that awareness follow him, not like pressure, but like presence, something that stayed just behind his thoughts, reshaping them, and as he stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the skyline, the cool night air did not clear his mind the way it usually did, instead it sharpened it, forcing him to replay the moment again and again, not the correction itself, but the way it had been delivered, calm, precise, undeniable, and more than that, the way he had missed it, the way he had dismissed the very person who understood the situation better than anyone at the table, and for a man who built his success on reading people as accurately as he read numbers, that realization landed deeper than any financial risk, and behind him, through the glass doors, Ava continued her work, moving through the space with the same rhythm, unaffected by the shift she had created, because for her, the world had always required this balance, to know more than she was allowed to show, to see more than she was expected to understand, and to speak only when the moment demanded it. And that moment had passed, leaving behind not triumph, but clarity, and as the evening moved closer to its end, the guests thinned out, the music softened, and the energy of the room settled into something quieter, more reflective, and Victor returned inside, not with urgency, but with intention, his steps slower, his focus sharper, and when he saw Ava again, standing near the service station organizing a final set of glasses, he did not approach immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he observed, truly observed, the way she moved, the way she interacted with others, the consistency in her presence that had nothing to do with the moment and everything to do with who she was, and when he finally walked over, there was no interruption, no abruptness, just a quiet alignment of two people standing in the same space, aware of what had already happened between them, and he spoke without pretense, without the polished edge he had carried earlier. "You changed the outcome tonight," he said. And the words were not exaggerated, not dramatic, they were simply accurate, and Ava looked at him, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. "The outcome was already there," she replied, "I just pointed at it," and again, the simplicity of her response stripped the moment of ego, leaving only truth, and Victor nodded slowly, absorbing not just the words, but the perspective behind them, because it challenged something fundamental in the way he had always operated, the belief that control meant creating outcomes, when in reality, sometimes it meant recognizing them, and he exhaled quietly, a small release of something he had not realized he was holding, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence itself carried meaning, and in that silence, the distance between assumption and reality felt clearer than ever, and as Ava picked up her tray once more, preparing to finish the last of her responsibilities, Victor did not stop her, did not redirect her, because for the first time that night, he understood that her path was not defined by the room, or by him, or by any expectation placed upon her. And as she walked away, not hurried, not slow, just steady, he remained where he was. Watching not with authority, but with recognition, because the lesson had already been given, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a precision that made it impossible to ignore, and in a world where power often spoke the loudest, it was the quiet clarity of someone overlooked that had rewritten everything. By the time the last glass was cleared and the final guest stepped into the elevator, the room no longer felt like a stage for power, it felt like a place that had been quietly rewritten, and Victor Hale stood near the window one last time, looking out over the city that had always responded to his decisions, his instincts, his voice. But tonight the city looked the same while something inside his understanding had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently, because for the first time in a long time, he had not been the one who saw everything clearly, and that realization did not diminish him, it redefined him, and across the room Ava Monroe finished aligning the last set of glasses, her movements as precise as they had been at the beginning of the night, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and perhaps for her, nothing had. Because this was not a transformation, it was a continuation of who she had always been, someone who carried knowledge without needing recognition, someone who understood that value does not announce itself, it reveals itself when necessary, and as she removed her apron and folded it neatly, placing it in her locker, there was no sense of victory, no pause to reflect on what had changed, because her focus had never been on changing the room, it had been on staying aligned with what was true, and that difference, subtle but profound, was what made the moment so powerful. And Victor walked toward the exit, his step steady, his posture composed, but his thoughts no longer followed the same patterns they had when he arrived, and just before he reached the door, he stopped, not because he needed to, but because something unfinished remained, and he turned, his gaze finding Ava one last time as she stepped out from the staff hallway, now without the tray, without the uniform that had defined her role in the eyes of others, and for a brief moment, they stood in the same space again, not as opposites, not as roles, but as two individuals who had witnessed the same truth from different directions, and Victor spoke, not to correct, not to lead, but to acknowledge. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, unadorned, carrying none of the weight of performance, only the clarity of realization, and Ava met his gaze, her expression calm, unchanged. Because the statement did not surprise her, it did not validate her, it simply existed, and she nodded once, not in acceptance, not in approval, but in recognition that he had seen what needed to be seen, and for a moment, the silence between them held more meaning than any conversation could have, because it was not about what had happened, it was about what had been understood, and Victor gave a small nod in return before turning and walking out into the night, not as the man who had entered that room with certainty, but as someone who had learned that certainty without awareness is incomplete. And as the door closed behind him, the city lights reflected once more against the glass, unchanged, steady, indifferent, and inside, Ava stepped into the quiet hallway, her footsteps soft, her pace unhurried, moving forward without looking back, because she did not need to. The moment had already passed, the lesson had already been given, and it did not belong to her to carry, only to deliver. And in the end, it was never about proving someone wrong, it was about revealing what had been right all along, that power can fill a room, but clarity can change it, and that the voices most often overlooked are sometimes the ones that understand the most. And on that night, in that room, she did not raise her voice, she did not demand attention, she simply spoke when it mattered, and everything else followed.